Good afternoon, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Welcome to this Christmas-themed faculty chat, one of the events in the Signum Symposia. I'm Sørina Higgins, chair of the Language and Literature Department here at Signum, and I have two of our fine faculty with us today. I have Kris Swank and Karl Persson, who are both preceptors on our faculty, and they're going to talk to us about several Christmas-themed things today. Tolkien, Lewis Carroll, Chesterton, mythopoeia, and ghosts, among other topics. So before I start asking them questions about the literature today, we just have a few announcements. We want to let you know about some other upcoming events to keep your eye on. In January, we have a very special event. Dr. Tom Shippey is doing a seminar, kind of a mini class. It's going to be 3 90-minute lectures. They're going to be on Thursdays, January 12th, 19th, and 26th at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and he's talking about Tolkien's Beowulf. So this is a really great opportunity. If you missed his full semester Beowulf class, this is a great chance to get some of that information. And even if you took that class, he'll be taking a little bit of a different perspective, sort of giving the history of Tolkien's involvement with Beowulf and his lecture, his translation, his notes and commentaries. I hope you can be there for that. It's going to include some of Tolkien's personal reactions to the poem as well. And then I also want to remind you that we have our big conference coming up, MythMoot 4, and the theme is Invoking Wonder. This is going to be June 1st through 4th in Leesburg, Virginia, and you can go to mythgard.org/events/mythmoot-4, that's a Roman numeral 4, to check that out and submit an abstract if you want to present a paper. So those are a couple of really important upcoming events. And now, as everyone's getting ready for Christmas coming up in just a few days, we want to talk about Christmas and myth-making. So, Kris and Karl, I thought I'd start out by asking you to define and discuss this important term, mythopoeia, or maybe we could even debate different pronunciations of it. So, Kris, would you like to start us off and tell us a little bit about that term?
Well, it is credited to Tolkien and the poem that he wrote with that term, and in light of that, I just look at it as myth-making. So any writer who wants to create a secondary world or a mythology in this world is mythopoeia.
Okay. Karl, do you want to add on to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm using it in a sense, the way Tolkien uses it, but of course I'm talking about G.K. Chesterton and his work on Charles Dickens, and Chesterton of course comes before J.R.R. Tolkien. So what I'm using it, but I mean of course Chesterton says a lot about mythopoeia. He just doesn't use the word precisely. So the way I'm using it is to talk about that kind of narrative that sort of hangs just in the middle between the earthly realm and the transcendent. So it gestures toward the beyond, maybe without even being very definitive about what that beyond is. So it's sort of a mystery that invites or gestures. It's not strictly realism. There's sort of a fairy element, but it's not all-out fantasy either. It's a gesturing. That's how I would define it.
Okay, so you're probably each going to get into this with your specific authors, but let me ask this question. So how can one make a myth? Doesn't a myth have to evolve sort of naturally from a culture and be, created by many people unintentionally over time? How could just one guy sit down in his study in England and make up a myth? So, Kris, you want to tackle that first?
Well, of course, Tolkien did that in the Ainulindale and the other Silmarillion materials, creating a pantheon of gods, creating the world. But invariably, you find that people who try to create myths rely on existing myths, and you'll see that in both Tolkien and L. Frank Baum's attempts at making a mythology for Santa Claus, is that you take some things that evolved from the culture and you add your own elements in. And so you've got a new recipe there.
Mm-hmm. So does Chesterton or does Dickens do something similar?
Yes, I mean the essay I'm looking at, it's called Christmas Books by Chesterton, and he's looking at Charles Dickens and Christmas, and he opens it by saying that the uh, the mystery of Dickens is the mystery of Christmas and vice versa. Uh, so he does what Chesterton does when he's writing at his best. He looks at mystery, but of course this mystery he's talking about is the mystery of celebrations of Christmas, sort of going back to the medieval period. So he's talking about how Dickens, in the most famous work being Christmas Carol, but he talks about a few of his other Christmas pieces, how Dickens kind of channels this ancient web of mythopoeia in his work.
Okay, so he says that, so Chesterton says that A Christmas Carol is a good example of a Christmas mythology. How is he rating that?
Yes, he is quite a fan of A Christmas Carol, and he, for a variety, yeah, I mean he gives three qualities that you have to have in good Christmas stories, and one is what he calls crisis or drama. He compares it to a game I wasn't familiar with, but apparently it was a game called Snapdragons, where you put raisins in a bowl of brandy, light it on fire, and you eat them and extinguish the fire in your mouth, and it's dangerous. So he talks about Christmas stories needing this sort of dramatic, dangerous quality. He's the second thing he says that it needs antagonism. So it should be a roaring fire in the middle of darkness and cold. It's sort of the bright spot, and everything else is bleak. So there's almost this contrast between the inner warmth and the fog outside. And the third thing he wants is the grotesque. He really likes how over the top Dickens' ghosts are. He calls them goblins. He likes, so if you think of the classic Alistair Sim Christmas Carol, sort of how overly dramatic that is. Chesterton loves that, and he says the grotesque is better at representing joy than even what is beautiful. He says there's often something sad about what is beautiful, but to represent joy, you need the grotesque. And those are his sort of three things that you need in Christmas stories, and he says Dickens has all these things in spades.
Wow, count on Chesterton for coming up with a surprising list of qualities, right? When you ask somebody what they love about their favorite Christmas stories, they don't usually think of conflict and the grotesque and antagonism. Kris, how does that compare to Tolkien's sort of list of qualities that good myths have?
Actually, as Karl was speaking, I was comparing that list to Tolkien's Father Christmas letters,
Yeah.
and all three of those are present, including playing snapdragons at Christmas. There is 1926 or 7 or 8 in there. The man in the moon comes down to visit Father Christmas in the North Polar Bear, and he gets drunk playing snapdragons and has to be rolled under the sofa, which is quite fun. So that must have been a very popular Christmas pastime. But they also have the threat of the goblin invasion through the years, and the grotesqueries of the goblins. So I think that Chesterton might have enjoyed Tolkien's Christmas letters as a story.
Yeah. What about eucatastrophe? Is that essential for Tolkien in A Christmas Story? Or is that to be postponed till an Easter story, perhaps?
Yes, I don't know. Well, the thing we have with Tolkien and the Father Christmas letters is that this was a private mythology that he was creating for his children. He didn't intend for it to be published or distributed the way we have now. So I think that he was maybe more focused on what we would call Easter eggs in a video game or a Marvel superhero movie, where if you're in the know and you see little things happening in the background, you get more out of it. And I think that they're private jokes and their references to family events, rather than trying to be creating some broader mythology for the public. So I'm not quite sure if his on fairy stories and eucatastrophe applies to these letters or not.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a step back now. This is great. We've already gotten into some really important ideas, but let's take a step back and just sort of, each of you will go back and forth and kind of give an overview of the texts that you're discussing. So Kris, why don't you do a little bit more about the Father Christmas letters, then we'll go back and forth and we'll come back to L. Frank Baum in a minute. So just for those who haven't read or seen them, there they are. Tell us about that book.
In 1920, Tolkien's oldest son, John, had asked about Father Christmas, which in America we call Santa Claus. They're basically the same characters now. And please, if I start coughing, I apologize. I've had a cold this week. And he began a tradition of writing in the persona of Father Christmas or one of Father Christmas's friends Christmas letters to the children for 23 years. I'm going to let Karl pick it up here for a second.
Okay. So tell us a little bit more. You've already mentioned there's this essay of Chesterton's about A Christmas Carol or about Dickens in general.
Yeah, I'll give the title actually because it's free online. The book it's in, which is free on Project Gutenberg, is it's Chesterton. It's called Appreciations and Criticisms of the Works of Charles Dickens. It's basically a collection of his prefaces to the Dickens books. But this one is called Christmas Books, which shouldn't be confused with the one in Chesterton's biography of Dickens, which is not as good as the one called Christmas Books. So that's the essay, and of course the book I'm talking about primarily is Dickens' Christmas Carol. With some nice grotesque pictures on the front there. So.
Nice. Without which no Christmas celebration is complete. And Carita said, no holiday celebration is complete without alcohol and fire. And a copy of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, right, Carita? Great. Okay, and then Kris, you also wanted to bring in L. Frank Baum's The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. So what is that? I hadn't heard of that work before.
This is a lesser-known work of his. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written in 1900, and then this was the second novel that he wrote before he wrote any sequels to the Oz books. And it was an attempt to create a backstory for Santa Claus. Since all we have really is him as an old man, Baum wondered how he became a gift giver, and he created a mythology that was separate from the Oz to begin with, and then it got enfolded into the Oz books later.
Okay. So it's a superhero origin story for Santa Claus.
Indeed.
Yeah, but it's not, is it not connected to the St. Nicholas stories?
It's a completely different mythology from that. This is more of a hero story. An abandoned foundling orphan human is raised by fairies in a forest and eventually becomes an immortal toy maker to give children joy. So it's a completely invented mythology, not related to St. Nicholas of Myra.
Okay, great. That's fascinating. So what resonances does it have then with Tolkien's Father Christmas?
What's really interesting is that both of them felt that there needed to be some conflict, and I go back to what Karl was saying about Chesterton's requirements for a good Christmas story. And in Tolkien's Father Christmas letters, there are occasional battles with goblins. In Baum's Life and Adventures of Santa Claus, the antagonists are called aguas. They're giant, invisible, supernatural creatures that cause children to misbehave, and they don't like it that Claus is giving the children joy, so they attack him.
Okay. So we've got elements of the antagonist, the conflict, the grotesque in there as well. That's fascinating. So, Karl, did you want to? Well, no, we'll save that. We'll save the idea of the dichotomies for later on and breaking that down. So, what else do you want to talk to us about with hauntings and ghostliness and the grotesque in Christmas, Karl?
Oh, well. What else do I want to say about that?
For sort of kind of background on the text, and then we can go deeper.
Yeah, I mean, for background on the texts, I mean, one of the things I like to use this text for is for thinking about Christmas mythopoeia more generally. And sorry, is this what you want to save till later?
No, that's fine. That's great. Let's go into the mythopoeia more generally.
Okay, you know, oh, okay. Um, yeah, one of the reasons I like this essay is because it gives a lens for looking at uh, kinds of stories that go on around Christmas, and doesn't uh, sort of pit one story against another. So um, you will get people who will want to say, if you have other mythopoeic stories uh, going on around Christmas, they are in sort of competition with the main religious meaning of Christmas. And I like what Chesterton does here because he wants it all. I mean, he doesn't, in this essay, he's of course talking about Dickens, so he doesn't actually say that much about the Christian story per se, in the same way that Dickens doesn't, but it's always sort of implicit there in the background. But this offers a lens for viewing all kinds of myths like Santa Claus and all these things. Looking at these myths sort of as caught up generally in the sort of well, these three notes of Christmas, you could actually apply them to the incarnation, I would argue. And so in certain ways, it's the idea that there's sort of a major spiritual overturn here. And all these things follow in its train, and that's why we think about these things. So there's, if you think of the celebration of Twelfth Night with the almost Halloween-like, it's a supernatural overturning time. And the mythopoeia around it gestures to that. I don't know if that was sort of a stream of half thought.
Yeah,
You
no,
can ask me.
this is good because I was wondering as you were each giving the introductions to the text, like, okay, we have these foundational ideas, the making of myths, these literary qualities of good stories, especially Christmas stories, these ideas of sort of deeper spiritual reality and incarnation and so forth. But how are all these things connected specifically to an historical idea of Christmas? So where does Jesus come in? Where does the baby in the manger come in? Where does the sort of historical particularity of Bethlehem and all of that connect to these stories, right? Because we've been talking about other characters so far. We've been talking about Santa Claus, and we've got Scrooge there somewhere in the story. So I feel a little bit of a disconnect, but I imagine you two can reconnect those.
Do you want to go, Chris? I've said a lot. So.
I know I've been over here coughing.
Your voice there.
In both of my works, there is no mention of the baby Jesus, Bethlehem, the Nativity at all. They really focus on this idea that Karl just brought up of this midwinter time, particularly from, in the Christian tradition, Christmas to Epiphany, being a time of overturning and misrule. Dr. Dimitri Fimi, one of our Signum faculty, posted on Twitter a few days ago that in Greece they have a tradition, and I was looking up the name of these little beings, of the Kali Kontrazaroi. Oh, she's going to get me for that pronunciation. But the pictures looked like the little black goblins from the Father Christmas letters, and they come up from the earth between Christmas and Twelfth Night, and they create chaos. And this is an idea that's reflected in many different cultures, the Scandinavian cultures, all the way down to through the Baltics and around the Mediterranean, that midwinter is a time of liminality and a time of chaos, and then order returns at the end of that period. And I think that Baum and Tolkien are playing with this idea rather than specifically the Christian Christmas story.
Okay. All right. You just asked, without knowing it, a question that Andy Higgins sent in. He asked about Chesterton, so this will bring you back in, Karl. Does Chesterton especially say anything about Christmas as a liminal time? In Old Norse tradition, this is a time when elves and trolls come out and we tell ghost stories, like M.R. James. So does Chesterton emphasize that as well?
I mean, he's implying that. That's what he's getting at with Christmas goblins. And he in the background he has these sort of traditions of things like celebrations of Twelfth Night, and yeah. So he has in the back of his head these kind of medieval traditions. I mean, he actually mentions the like sort of the northern celebration of Christmas. You know, with the fires roaring and the axes on the wall and the darkness outside, and you know you're sort of protesting the frost giants or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that is mentioned. To get back to what you said, Sørina, though, about the sort of you know what is the relation between these stories and sort of the manger and Bethlehem and the story of Christ and whatnot is and I'm going to get very sort of interpretively meta here, but the incarnation and the story of it is so laden and so potent that actually to get into it you need a number of stories around it to dialogue with it and to make conversation. And so what am I getting at? I'm thinking of the medieval mystery plays, particularly the Second Shepherd's Play, which is, if any of you know it, it's kind of a fun play because it's the Christmas story, but it's these shepherds who are really kind of clowns, and one of them's trying to steal sheep, and you know they toss him in a blanket, and very sort of picaresque and comic and kind of grotesque, very anachronistic. They're all saying, you know, "Bye, Mary," and you know, of course, Mary isn't Mary yet, but the medieval writers they don't care. You know, but so and there's sort of a joy there, and it's the idea that alongside these sort of very solemn church celebrations, you need a levity to discourse with it and some sort of humorous or uncanny counterpart. So this is part of it, that if you just strip the story bare and have solemnity all the time, you actually, I think, lose some of the meaning. You know, the point is, you know, and I'm again thinking of sort of multiple layers of interpretation, the medieval interpretation of the four senses of Scripture and stuff like this. And so there's a way that these stories, things like ghost stories, end up being reflections. Like ghost stories are reflections on the supernatural. You know, they're thinking about what happens when things are supernaturally overturned. So there's ways that rather than sort of it becoming an either-or thing in a sort of dialectical way, it's more of an analogical discussion. So you know, it's kind of right that a figure like Santa Claus is sort of like half Norse pagan god and half Christian saint. like that's exactly how it should be, and that's sort of how the conversation works. And I don't think it's an eclipse of the Christian story. It's sort of a the conversation explodes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and of course Jesus himself was the one who would restore order and bring light out of the darkness, and so it's good that you have all of these different kinds of explanations of the misrule, and of course Jesus' story is bringing the order back to the chaos.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you were saying it was going to explode with interpretations there. So let's do that, because there are at least 3 different ways I want to go simultaneously here, but being time bound, we shall have to do them one at a time. So let's see which one to pull first. So Karl, you said, and I paraphrase, so we need all these other stories around the incarnation, because it's so big or it's so solemn, we kind of need to go through other stories to get at it. And maybe I'm misparaphrasing you, and this is why I'm going to ask this question now. I always thought it was the other way around. To me, I thought that none of the other stories made any sense without the Christian meta-narrative. And that's where all the other stories draw their power. And so we see in different generations, we see certain stories being really popular. So right now we have the superhero story. Well, it's really essentially a retelling of the Christ story, right? And that's where the superhero stories draw their power. So what do you think there?
What do I think? I think I want a both and approach. You know, and it's true. You know, and I mean certainly yeah, I mean part of where these stories are drawing their power is from something explicitly Christian or something explicitly good in creation or something. You know, so that is true. And if you rip the heart out of that, you actually lose the story. So I think a good example of ripping the heart out of something is what we see in sort of modern commercialization, where we will take some of these myths. You know, people talk about wanting to save Christmas or whatever. I mean, the best way to save Christmas is to take it out of the hands of white capitalism and write good stories. That's what I would say. But to go back to you know, whether you need the stories to understand the incarnation, or whether you need the incarnation to understand the stories. Yeah. I would say in human experience, I mean, ontologically, the stories all everything takes its meaning from the incarnation. But experientially and pedagogically, we as humans need the stories. We need the conversation. And that's sort of what I'm suggesting.
Oh, well done. That was great.
I'm not sure that it goes chicken and egg. I mean, we had superheroes before we had Jesus. We had Hercules, Odysseus, Gilgamesh, and they were having midwinter celebrations and the rebirth of the light long before the era of Christianity. So I think that it goes further back and deeper, perhaps, than just one religion, but to the whole human experience.
So is that what you meant, Karl, that experientially we have the other stories first? And Lewis would say that those other stories prepared our imaginations so that when the incarnation happened historically, we were ready to receive it. But you're also saying, you're sort of doing like a Duns Scotus thing, that the incarnation is so ontologically necessary that it precedes even the stories that preceded it?
Yeah, I mean it depends whether one is talking ontologically and theologically, or whether one is talking in terms of the development of the histories of stories. Because Kris is absolutely right. There's all sorts of stories that come before Christianity happens. So I mean, what I'm saying will depend on one's ontological and theological proclivities. But yes, if you take the incarnation as ontologically prior, as someone like Lewis, then you're going to say, whether it's turned backwards or forwards in history, it's all going to be drawing on creation and the incarnation.
Right.
But yeah, that depends on whether that's what you believe or not. Yeah.
Charles Williams said two interesting things on this point. One is, he said that if the incarnation had not been necessary for our salvation, it would be necessary for our art and our literature. Yeah. And the other is that he said, because it's so necessary and so deeply rooted in human imagination, if it hadn't happened yet, all that one could say is that it hadn't happened yet. So there are a couple of interesting ontological points to put alongside that. So because this is so explosive, I'm going to just like violently jump to the other point that I wanted to take there, which is, for both of you, let's go deeper into the ghosts and the haunting and sort of the other beings and the supernatural. And Carita has a question for you, Kris. Do you know if there's any connection between Baum's story and the figure of Olent Zero? To my understanding, he is a Santa-ish figure whose story has been given the adopted by a fairy treatment in fairly recent history. Do you know about that?
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one. How do you spell that name?
Olentzero.
I am not familiar with that figure, so I can't really speak to that at all. But mortals being adopted by fairies is a fairly common thing in fairy tales and in heroic stories. Lancelot is one, certainly in the Arthurian, that people might be familiar with. He was an orphan and adopted by the Lady of the Lake, and so you see that sort of motif occurring again and again. It's certainly not a unique thing to Frank Baum. I think he was playing with existing motifs here.
Yeah, okay. A similar question came from Alex Way, if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. The point about the medieval mystery plays reminds me of the shadow puppet plays of Indochina. They have the same mix of the sublime and the ridiculous. For example, Rama might speak pure Sanskrit, but the demons speak vernacular language and are partly there for comic relief. So talk to us more about these beings of mischief, these in-between liminal creatures. What are they, and why do we have these sort of demons or fairy creatures mixed in with the Christmas stories?
What are they, and why do we have them mixed in? That's a good question, and I mean what they are. I mean, what they are varies from story to story, but I mean, I think the basic idea behind them largely is that if you look at what the incarnation is, it's a time when heaven is brought very close to earth, and the supernatural and the natural are, it's all. I mean, it's almost like sort of a more celebratory version of that tearing of the veil at Easter, between the natural and the supernatural, and so the idea is, you know, in the same way that when you have the tearing of the veil at Easter, you have people getting up from their graves and walking around. You know, this is Christmas. This is when God comes to earth. So what else might not happen? You know, when the veil is rent. You know, you might end up seeing your miserly former partner who, you know, died 7 years ago and is carrying chains around the world. You know, you might have Christmas gardens blooming, which is another motif that happens. You know, and these might not all be good things, as the questioner mentioned, the demons. You know, there's negative hauntings too, and so yeah, it has to do with that sort of that closeness between the natural and the supernatural that brings about this sort of stories.
Okay.
That would be the theological reason. The narrative reason, you know, it's well, there's all sorts of narrative reasons. But one of the reasons they suggest for Norse mythology is that you can't bury dead bodies in the winter. So it's likely they're going to get up and do things. But so there's various cultural things, but one of the religious things I point to is the sort of thinning of the veil between the natural and the supernatural.
Okay. Well, Kris, let me ask you another sort of one of the literary reasons for it, and then I might come back to you again, Karl. So, Kris, why are they so naughty then? Why are they so mischievous? If this is supposed to be you know, the time when God is drawing near to mankind in order to reconcile humankind to himself, then why these tricky figures?
Well, I think a candle casts no light without darkness to cast the light upon. So you have to have that parallel. If you're going to have a great good come into the world, you have to have a great evil, or at least a great naughtiness, for the good to work upon. You know, it's just not a very good story. Also, if you're talking about storytelling, you do have to have antagonists and conflict in order to tell the stories. Certainly in the Norse, which Tolkien was playing on with his goblin invasions of the North Pole, They have a whole series of Christmas visitor tales where the hidden people, trolls, elves, goblins, would swarm upon various farmsteads at Christmas and eat up all the food. And then they'd have to be chased away. And whether this is pagan or Christian in origin, I think that folktale collectors collected about 200 versions of these kind of Christmas visitor stories, and it's just very prevalent across the whole of Northern Europe. So whatever the reason is, it resonated with people over time and place quite a bit.
Yeah. And Timothy Fisher brings us back to the theological reading again by saying, since the incarnation leads to the resurrection, we get the dead, aka ghosts, as beings looking for redemption, that is, resurrection. The dark of midwinter looks forward to the spring of resurrection. But is there something else going on as well if we read the whole sort of trajectory as a narrative? Is this a different way of looking at Christmas than we sort of North American commercialized capitalists are used to? Are we looking at a story in which Jesus comes to earth to kind of turn things topsy-turvy, to shake it up and mix it up and not be quite as saccharine and sweet and tidy as we're used to seeing?
Well, he did turn over the tables in the temple, so he could mix it up with the best of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, it sort of depends. Depends where you look, but largely, yes, the saccharine. We've really lost it in how saccharine and sentimental we are in North America. You know, like but a really good, for instance, a good story in sort of the old tradition is the Grinch, the Grinch who stole Christmas. This is fabulous. This is like a, you know, Scrooge turned into a monster. You know, he's going to steal Christmas. You know, he's like just an over the top. I was watching with my son the other day, and like the effort he puts into stealing Christmas in this very detailed way is just amazing. You know, but this is a great Christmas story in this tradition. So there's bits and pieces of it, and probably a younger version of myself would have ranted and railed against the bad stories, but now I look for the ones that might be good and try to push them on people. So.
Yeah. Well, something else that you maybe wanted to rant and rail about a bit. You've been talking about it in little pieces throughout, but tell us more about it now, about the way that we see a competition between the liturgical feast of Christmas, as understood by Christians, and then this pagan mythopoeia. So is there a competition between them? Shouldn't there be? Talk to us about that.
No, and this is my rant about Santa versus Jesus, basically. So I mean, there's this idea. Well, there's all kinds of thoughts about you know, whether people believe in. Do your kids believe in Santa? What do you tell them about Santa? You know, there's a school that says, you know, we don't talk about Santa because it's all about Jesus. You know, and again, I'm saying the reason. Well, and there's people who say, well, if you teach your kid to believe in Santa and to believe in Jesus, then you know when they find out Santa isn't real, they're going to think Jesus isn't real either. That's not a problem of Santa and Jesus. That's a problem because we don't teach people how to read, which is why I do what I do as a professor. Because there's various levels of stories and narratives, and we use this all the time. But because we've sort of reduced ourselves to sort of a thing. We think, you know, we must read Jesus the same way we read Santa, the same way we read a scientific text, the same way we, you know, and it's like, no, there's different genres. You know, can't we teach people to be complex readers, for goodness sake? You know, and read Santa in the mythopoeic way he's taken, and take the liturgical feasts in the religious way that they're present it and not make this sort of huge competition. I mean, I will say there is competition when it comes to money and greed, and I mean it's the mythopoeic and the Christian are competing very heavily with Mammon, and with Mammon, Milton has this great poem, the Ode to the Christ's Nativity, Ode to Christ's Nativity, and it's great because it's this baby Jesus coming, but he's turfing out all the pagan gods. So I like that image with regard to Mammon and capitalism. It's like, yeah, as Kris says, overturn the tables.
And Paul Melly also sent in another point related to that, overturning the tables. See Isaiah's prophecy in the Magnificat proclaimed by Mary upon learning of her pregnancy with Jesus. He puts forth his arm in strength and scatters the proud-hearted. He casts the mighty from their thrones and raises the lowly. He fills the starving with good things, sends the rich away empty. He protects Israel, his servant, remembering his mercy, the mercy promised to our forefathers. So that's an overturning, turning things upside down and being, in a way, a lord of misrule. Oh, that's great. Kris, did you want to say anything there about that, the conflict between the pagan and the Christian readings of Christmas?
I think that Christmas has a longer history as a pagan holiday than it does as a Christian holiday. I think the main Christian holiday was certainly Easter, and it's become Christmas fairly recently in history. When the Puritans were in charge of England, you weren't even allowed to celebrate Christmas because it had such a thick pagan tone to it, and Odin has always been peeking out behind Father Christmas, and very hard to quash those pagan traditions and gods, and the Yule log and the mistletoe and the ivy. And even if you cast Christian symbolism on top of previously pagan symbolism, it's always going to be at heart a time of midwinter and the solstice, and the Christmas is sort of layered on top of that. So I think it's a chicken and an egg sort of argument right there. Whether one has priority at this time of year than the other is really hard to tell, and it depends on where you're standing.
Right. So this next question I'm going to ask is a bit more of a culture wars question with possibly some political baggage. So if you want to skate around it, we can. But the question is, so therefore, since what you've both been saying, should Christians be scared because their holiday isn't really theirs, it's pagan? Or should non-religious people or neo-pagans be scared because Christians are trying to co-opt their holiday? Or is there some happier way to approach this, and is it related to the ways that we read, as Karl was saying?
Hey, I think everybody should just be happy and drink some cocoa and enjoy.
Drink some flaming raisins.
Absolutely. Play Snapdragons and whatever you celebrate it, because that's, I think, for my perspective, the important part.
Yeah. And so how do we do that as readers? Like, do the texts support that? Kris, do the texts support a kind of a live and let live approach, or are they mutually exclusive, or how are they layered?
Well, that's really interesting for Tolkien's point of view, because he has these Father Christmas letters that never really talk about the Nativity or Christianity. It's all a very secular view, and Tolkien being such a fervent Catholic, I think that's very interesting. That's what he wrote for his own children. So if it's good enough for Tolkien, it's good enough for me.
Oh, and thanks for reminding me, because I meant to say this way back at the very beginning. So is this related to what Tolkien says about Lord of the Rings, that it's a deeply Christian book, but that its Christianity is implicit rather than explicit? Is he doing something similar to the Father Christmas letter?
I do think it's very similar, yes.
Yeah, and
it has morality, it has good and evil, all the Christian ideas without the Christian trappings.
Yeah. And that's one reason that he avoided finishing his Arthurian tale, is because he said the problem with the King Arthur story is it's too Christian. It doesn't work for myth, because it's sort of like it just wears its Christianity on its face rather than deeply embedded. Yeah. What do you think, Karl?
About which part, particularly?
Should Christians be scared that their holiday is actually pagan, and should neo-pagans be scared that Christians are co-opting their holiday? Or is there a different way to read those layers?
No, and I mean, I would want to do a thorough analysis of the origins of everything before I were going to do what is, like, with a lot where it's very hard to pin down. We just did the Beowulf class this semester, and so we know this, trying to pin down all the mythologies and stuff. So, I mean, I would actually go back to, you know what I go back to is I go back to Chesterton's idea of mystery, and back to the sense of you know, in both the sort of Christian narrative and the pagan Yule narrative, there is a sense of mystery. You know, and that is sort of the unexpected, the things might suddenly change. You know, and I think well, one of the things that mystery does for us is it keeps us humble. You know, this is what really annoys me when people go around wanting to say the true meaning of Christmas. Let's get back to the true meaning of Christmas, and I'm like something like the Incarnation. Like, who are you to say you fully understand all of that and can just go around sort of pinning it on billboards like that? You know, so this sense of mystery, I think, is something that the you know, both the Christian story and the Yule narratives that go back before that they come together on is that you know, humans are small in a mysterious world, and I mean that's part of what makes the camaraderie too. Is you know, whether we're pagans celebrating the Yule holiday or Christians, we're small, and we can toast to that and take care of each other in light of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. We've been getting a lot of comments coming into this last little discussion, and a lot of them are taking a kind of an Inkling's true myth approach to this question, suggesting that maybe it's not Christians co-opting a pagan holiday so much as it is God co-opting, in Mickey's words, or Providence setting it up, in Timothy Fisher's words, that maybe he knew that Adam and Christ, the pagans, would celebrate the rebirth of the sun, so that, you know, God providentially allowed that these holidays would be layered on top of one another, because, you know, the midwinter celebration was not the original date. Timothy points out that the church celebrated the Nativity and the Incarnation, but they became layered later on. Mm-hmm. So this is a matter of textual interpretation, isn't it, as to which holiday is the truer meaning, the more originary or the more completed meaning.
We will never know.
Yeah, and this is why I say I'd like to do a lot of research and write an essay because there is a lot of sort of fake stories that go around about these things on various sides. You know, sort of if you think of the popular meme histories of Christmas, but both on all sides, there's these popular histories, and it becomes so much harder to actually sort these things. I mean, there's one school that would say Christmas was invented by the Victorians, and you know, they were all mm-hmm. trying to mine this, you know, stuff they invented, basically. You know, but there's all these things. So I'd want to. I didn't come here to say where. I came here to talk about the important points of Christmas, so I'm not going to give a history.
Right, exactly. And to bring it back to myth making again, where we started, I mean, all these authors that we're studying value the human imagination so much that they wouldn't be quite so interested in what came first and what originated where as what the imagination does with it and what it means for human readers and for human storytellers. So in about 5 minutes, we're going to start to wrap up, and Karl, I'm going to get you to read a Chesterton poem, but in those 5 minutes, what else does either of you want to say? What have you not gotten a chance to say about your texts? we kind of went all kinds of fascinating places, but I hope I didn't cut short any sort of closer readings or particular moments you wanted to pull out.
One thing I'd like to say about Baum's book is that it was written at a time, 1902, when some of the traditions that we in the 21st century think are pretty cemented about Christmas, the names of the reindeer. Go through them in your head right now. At that time that Baum was writing, he had the freedom to come up with his own names of reindeer, and they're completely different, and there's 10 reindeer. And he has a lot of other traditions that we think of as long-term, and it turns out that a lot of this was really created in the Victorian era. So the idea of the Santa's workshop and the North Pole and coming down the chimney and reindeer flying the sleigh were all first written about, even if they were orally told sooner than that, in the mid-19th century. And so Baum's book is kind of an interesting way of going back into history and seeing that you could still create your own Christmas mythology at that point. I'm not sure we'd have so much luck with that today if we started from scratch.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Great point. Karl, any other sort of wrap-up points on your text you didn't get to say?
The wrap-up point I had is that this... Sorry, are we okay?
Yeah, your audio blinked for a minute, but you're back.
Yeah. Okay, good. So this sense of mystery and these odd sort of notes of Christmas, Chesterton calls them. One of the things I find these really good for is they're good for one of the problems with the way we conceive of Christmas in modern times is people who are sad at Christmas, because you know, we have this sort of cheeriness and this happiness, but there's people who are depressed or are going through deep loss, and it's sort of like, you know, what is there for those people, people who are lonely, and I would suggest a refocus on sort of this mystery and some of these elements, you know, that can make a place for those people. I mean, it's become a complete cliche now, but I mean, you have Tiny Tim in Dickens. You know, there's some fairly serious themes discussed there, and so I would suggest by going back to this sense of mystery and this sense of Christmas mythopoeia that Chesterton is suggesting, we might be able to make more of a place for letting in those people on the outside, those deeply hurting people in darkness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that another reason for the ghosts and the sense of haunting and some of the darker themes that Chesterton brings up as well? Is that there's space for grief and loss in Christmas, that those who are suffering are not marginalized from Christmas?
Very much, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there any of that in the Father Christmas letters?
There is definitely in both Father Christmas letters and the Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. Both authors refer to the less fortunate and making sure that they're taken care of first, and try to bring them joy. That's definitely a concern of both authors.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Well, that's lovely. Well, we do have a few other questions coming in, but I think it would make sense to kind of end on that note and with a poem. So you have Chesterton's own Christmas poem to read to us, Karl, Child of the Snows. If anybody wants to find it and look at the text while he's reading, you can go to chesterton.org and find A Child of the Snows. Do you want to say anything about it to contextualize it before you read it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, of course, his bit on Dickens that I talked about doesn't really talk about the Christian Christmas story at all. It talks mostly about Dickens, but but this poem he wrote, it captures a lot of the sort of captures in very succinctly in 4 stanzas a lot of the notes of Christmas that I've talked about, the drama and crisis and the sort of the contrast of light and dark, and the maybe there's not so much grotesqueness in this poem. It's actually a very beautiful sounding poem, but yeah. So he captures in this poem this. He also draws on other Christmas traditions. So I mentioned the Milton poem, the turfing out of the gods. That comes at the end of Chesterton's poem. So when I read that, you can think of mammon and commercialism going out the window. So yeah, that's about what I wanted to say. Shall I proceed to it?
Yes, please. That would be lovely.
Okay. A Child of the Snows by G.K. Chesterton. There is heard a hymn when the panes are dim, and never before or again, when the nights are strong with the darkness long, and the dark is alive with rain. Never we know but in sleet and in snow, the place where the great fires are, that the midst of the earth is a raging mirth, and the heart of the earth a star. And at night we win to the ancient inn, where the child in the frost is furrowed. We follow the feet where all souls meet, at the inn, at the end of the world. The gods lie dead, where the leaves lie red, for the flame of the sun is flown. The gods lie cold, where the leaves lie gold, and a child comes forth, alone.
Oh, wow, what a perfect choice. That really wraps up a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. The sort of cycle myths being repeated in the Christian story, and yeah, it really is a sort of an in-between space. Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you both. That was a really inspiring conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thanks for your questions. Sorry we didn't get to every single one of them. But we hope that you enjoyed all of that and that everybody has a very Merry Christmas. I guess.
Merry Christmas. Good Yule.
Say goodbye to everybody for now. And everybody should go and play Snapdragons.
Yes.
Lots of brandy.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kris. Thanks, Karl.
Thanks, Sørina.
All right. Bye-bye.